So let's move on to the last session of this afternoon. It is about a book called Wanderers, Kings, Merchants. This is the book. And the author is Peggy Mohan. Peggy Mohan is a Trinidad-born author, also a linguist, who earned a PhD from the University of Michigan, USA, and migrated to India and worked as a professor of language studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and at Jamia Millia University, New Delhi. Her books include A Walk in C Minor and Jahajin. She recently won the Mathrubhumi Award for the Book of the Year of 2023. Mathrubhumi, incidentally, is based in Kerala. We just had an author from Kerala. So she won that award this year for this particular book. And in conversation with her, we have John D'Andrea from New York, who's based now in Auroville. He left school and home at the age of 18 to see the world. A caddy on the professional golf tour, he spent 8 years in Thailand studying meditation and internal martial arts. Oh, interesting, was drawn to Pondicherry after reading Michael Murphy's book, Golf in the Kingdom, and was immediately taken back by an experience at the Samadhi of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Currently, he works at the Matri Mandir and oversees the creation of the Auroville Fellowship Program. Please come on stage, Peggy. Please come, John.
So it's a privilege to sit here with you and discuss this book, because I just finished it, and not only do I appreciate the historical context of it, but I really fell in love with your style of writing. There's a certain rhythm and melody to it that just leaps off the pages. So I really, really enjoyed this. Could you give us a little bit of your background? Because I find your story so fascinating.
Okay, there are all sorts of backgrounds one can get into. Since you mentioned rhythm and melody, one of the things I had done in my rather checkered career is teach children music. And what you do sometimes is you compose songs. You don't only teach them how to execute what some great guy has written many, many years ago. So if you actually write songs, you understand you have a certain amount of space in the line to say everything. You cannot extend the line. It has a rhythm pulse that's already there. So if you write thinking that there's a format, there's a rhythm, you're doing it something like a song, you can't actually take too many liberties. Something else is interacting with you as you write. And you know, for example, when a line is too long or when a word is too heavy. So that's the sort of thing. But I think you were wanting to know a bit about my background. I'm from the West Indies. I'm from that community that you sometimes hear of Indians who migrated to the diaspora lands as migrant labor. So that was about 140, 150 years ago. So what that does is it puts Indians in a space that's called genuinely a Creole space. Creole not in the glamorous sense of white people from the tropics, no. Creole in the sense of Creole languages, the languages that are spoken in the Caribbean because of the whole slave experience, which we entered the same estates as them. We began to speak these languages. And those were languages that had come up in recent enough time that we could tell their history and match it to the way the languages look. These were hybrids. And we knew from looking at them that there was something about their grammar that was very West African. And there was something about their words that was unmistakably either European, either Portuguese, French, sometimes Dutch or English. So I had grown up seeing languages that were mixed. And I'd also looked as a college student at European languages, especially the ones Mediterranean. You know Latin, you know French, you know Spanish, you kind of know Portuguese. And you begin to see a similar kind of mix. These are not just Latin. Latin didn't merely hive off in many directions. Something else was responsible for these languages looking a little bit different. Then I came in 1979 to live in India, and over many years of not necessarily always being in the academic world, I got a chance to look around. And if you're too good at things, if you learn languages too well, and you don't think that there's any difficulty involved, you miss quite a lot. It's nice to sometimes be struggling and not know, and to look at Bengali and Marathi and hear everybody saying, oh, but the words come from the same place. Well, they don't quite. They come from different Prakrits. But you can't actually understand Bengali from knowing Marathi. What you can't do is as important as what you can do. Like people say, oh, from Latin you can figure Sanskrit. I could do a bit of that. It helped knowing Latin, starting to learn Sanskrit in college. But at the same time, what you couldn't do was much more significant. There's something about Sanskrit that was very Indian that Latin was not. And there were some things that were there. So that set me on the journey to find how languages mix. And it isn't just that they grow up and at some strange point in their evolution, they're different. No. Something happens that makes them all turn out different. And just as with all of us, we have two parents. So it's a two-parent model that I use, that you have the male side, which is the one that you see first. You see all the words and all the familiar things. Yes, there's this word in Bengali. Yes, there's this word in Marathi. But all the things you don't see, Bengali has no grammatical gender. Marathi has 3. Hindi has 2. What is this about? There's a lot of story in that we completely miss, because these are the things that they don't leap out at us. And that's about the other parental line in Indian language stories. Indian languages never were talked of in this way. Even European languages, we would talk about, well, the Roman legions went around the Mediterranean. That is true. They were men. Please remember, they didn't send women soldiers. So how did these men have children? There's only one way I know. They met local women. And how did all the migrants in India have children? The geneticists have actually told us most of these were men anyway. They were not women. So they came, and in the same way, they propagated their line, not on their own. The minute you get into the idea that something is happening where you have a two parental strands blending, you begin to see a familiar pattern in India, in Europe, in the Caribbean Creoles, and lately in Swahili. You begin to see that when men travel, interesting languages come up, and they're not the only ones who make them. So all sorts of things come together, including the serendipity outside of the academic system, to sit and think and wonder and see patterns which anyone else should have seen. I'm just astonished that I had to happen onto this first, because there are many people who know much more about Marathi than me, Bengali than me, Punjabi. I end up writing about Malayalam. I don't know it well enough to be doing this, but somehow I happen to find the same pattern somewhere there, which I think someone else should have seen, not me, but it didn't happen that way. So I'm the one looking at how languages hybridize in India due to migration, and the migration is almost always men.
You open up the book with a beautiful metaphor of this tiramisu bear. And could you share the story with the audience? It's so fascinating how you use it as a metaphor for how languages and also how civilizations have blended over time.
Yeah, actually, when I'm writing a book, even if it's an academic book, even if it's a technical topic like language hybridization, which has a lot of linguistics in it, I do sit and wait until the right beginning comes to me. It may come to me one morning when I'm sitting, having my tea, doing a crossword and making notes in the margin of the newspaper, my favorite kind of morning, when I know at some point I'll go upstairs. And I kept seeing this image that I had found in a story somewhere of grizzly bears, because of climate change warming the Arctic a little earlier than it was supposed to, suddenly waking up a little too early and traveling a little too far north. Now, polar bears, female polar bears, are supposed to be on ice floes, but there are less ice floes, so they're on land. So here come these male grizzly bears. They meet female polar bears who are in their mating season. These grizzlies shouldn't even be there. They have their own bears on a different mating season. They mate, and you get these bears which have a very characteristic look, which is to say some fur on the paws, not too much. They can perhaps walk on grass and so, but they're adapted to snow. A bit of the look of a polar bear, a little bit creamy rather than white. The broad shoulders and so of a grizzly bear. But the point, what is interesting about I said, what would I call such a bear? And my daughter said, a tiramisu bear. So you got tiramisu in the sense of there being layers of brown and creamy white. And what is interesting to me about the tiramisu bear is if you see one, you know its story, because there is only one story. A polar bear cannot migrate south and mate with a grizzly female because he cannot walk on the kind of barren ground that he would have to walk on to go south. He can only live in snow and ice. And a female grizzly bear cannot go north to meet a polar bear because females don't migrate. And I fixed on that men migrate purposefully or in short-term migrations, women don't. So whenever you see huge populations move, like the first Indians coming into India, that was not a migration. They were not purposefully moving towards a place they had heard about. There was no knowledge of India. They were spreading out from Africa, the first migration out of Africa. So they had women, because women are part of the kind of spread of a hunter-gatherer community that's moving on. But the minute it gets into migrants, you get men being the migrants and women being the locals they happen to find. This year I thought I was goofing off, going to the Masai Mara and Serengeti. I'm supposed to be writing, I'm writing another book on all of these things. I should be writing, I should be meeting people. East Africa is a wonderful place where the same thing happens. Swahili is another one of these tiramisu bear languages. But then I went into Masai Mara and our guide showed us one herd of gazelles and he said, this is a bachelor herd. And true, every single gazelle in that little herd was male and young. What was going on? And a few minutes later, we move on and we see a herd that's all female, except for one huge alpha male with large horns and one nervous-looking youngish male. And our guide said, he's about to be driven out of the herd. So the idea that there's something called the spare male, the heir and the spare, the surplus male, and that males have been migrating because in settled herds, settled communities, there isn't a need for the amount of second and third and fourth sons that tend to get born. There's a need for women because women are basically the nucleus of that of the community. Any Malayalis in the audience knows that a man is a mappila. He comes as your son-in-law. But the matriarch is basically the center, the nucleus, the heart of the community. So when I looked at animals having this kind of pattern, then it struck me that it's true that if female bears don't migrate, female gazelles don't migrate. And true enough, rarely do female humans migrate until things are so well set up that it's safe. It's not really much of a migration. British women didn't come into India in large numbers during the Raj until the Suez Canal opened. Before that, all that long journey around was British men, and I'm guessing second and third sons, the spares, coming here because what would they do in England? England was pretty much sorted out. We have to move on to the new lands. And the initial British migration, shall we call it, into India was not very different from the others. They met Indian women, they had children. They did a few things different. They didn't say, we're here forever, and those children are our next generation and heirs, because they had a flow of people constantly coming in through the boats, and they did intend one day to go back. So that's a big, big difference. But you get the sense of the two-stranded approach to languages, which was missing here. So when you said, this language is descended from Sanskrit, well, Sanskrit didn't have descendants. Sanskrit was a perfect evolutionary dead end, preserved. It's the uncle language, not the mother language. Partly, for very real reasons, the Sanskrit people who came in were men. Almost all of them were men. So if you think that Sanskrit is your ancestor, he's your uncle. He's not even your father. He's definitely not your mother. That's a real gender bender, because the local women were the ones who passed on mother tongues. So Sanskrit's very much a father tongue. I would say it's an uncle tongue, because the languages, except for Malayalam, which picked up words that had a Sanskrit look to them, picked these words up from local Prakrits. So Prakrits were one step removed from Sanskrit, not a very big step. But the point is that Sanskrit itself, as in the Vedas, wasn't participating in this. It had worked itself into a nice, perfect little gem. And you don't go chipping away at a gem when you're happy with it. And that was, so you got later Sanskrit, which, again, the whole thing continued. The entire northwest of India, for a very long time, and maybe even till today, it's very understandable that men learn Sanskrit, men learn Persian, men learned Urdu, men ate meat, men went to the kotas and listened to Urdu-inspired music. The women stayed at home, spoke local languages, they never spoke Sanskrit. It was actually not allowed. They didn't pick up Urdu until very recently, 100 years or so back. And they lived almost an they were ethnically different, not just gender-wise different from the men. And this is you see this in certain tribes here and there, like in the Caribbean, where there was a time when Caribs attacked an Arawakan village in St. Vincent in the year 1200, before Columbus. And they were cannibals anyway, they replaced the men. To this day, that tribe has words that are allowed for the men to use and words that the women are allowed to use. The men are allowed to use women's words, though that makes them sound babyish. So I'm seeing a pattern that's repeating and repeating, and accounts in a very interesting way for India, and which makes us all look terribly mixed, which I think is a very good thing. This is my own story too.
It's fascinating. We were speaking earlier about this. I was saying English for me, in America at least, I've always thought it was a language for lawyers, because there's so many different ways to say the same thing, and there's so much wiggle room there. So a lot of times someone will say something, and then there's always an exit door, and they'll say, well, actually, I didn't mean it that way. I meant it in a good way. You could say maybe German, there's more precision to it. It could be a language for engineers, perhaps. I spent 10 years in Thailand. I speak Thai. there are very few rules, there are very few words. What does either the simplicity or the complexity of a language really tell us about its people?
I think, I don't know how you account for all the differences in the world and in terms of migration out of Africa. I mean, human beings pretty much did have a single source, unless there were many different sources in Africa, I don't know. But one thing that we see when we look at, say, the tribes in India and the early tribes, and in fact, even the Andaman Islanders, you see complexity in the grammar. You see quite a lot of what we would now call gender marking, gender agreement. And we find that in the collision of languages, creating new languages, what you get is simplification happening more and more. Because when a male group comes into an area and sets up a larger group, not just a little village, you begin to find that languages have to become more accessible. So increasingly, as languages in India have been through more and more of these tiramisu bear experiences, you begin to see details knocking off them as they become accessible and the languages of larger communities. We've reached a stage where we use words like Marathi. Now, Marathi was not a single language when it arose. It was a large number of different dialects, some of them much more southern in flavor, and some of them much more northern. But now we think of it as a single thing because there's a new ecology, which is the written word, the journalistic experience, government. So each time we go through the tiramisu bear experience and hybridize, languages get a little simpler and they also cover more and more territory. Like what's called the Hindi belt is anything but. In the 12th century, Hindi was a language of a place called Delhi, Dehlavi. Then slowly, as it happened, Delhi is a capital city of the Delhi Sultanate, eventually the Mughals, then the British. It's going to have a lot more traction. It starts swallowing languages which were never its dialects, like Braj, Awadhi, Kannauj, and later going further towards Bengal into Bhojpuri. People who speak Bhojpuri, like my family in the Caribbean, we had the impression we were speaking bad Hindi. When you go further to the west, you get languages like in Rajasthan, Marwari, Mewari. They feel like Gujarati. So in a way, Hindi has moved and taken over its dialects in that area. It's moved into Magadhan, Bengali type space. It's moved into Gujarati type space. So what we call the Hindi belt is actually a language that's spreading. And the notion of a Hindi belt has more to do with literacy and schooling being in Hindi than that having been the original language of the area. So two things are happening: the mixing of languages and the spread and the enlarging of groups. And of course, at the top of it all is the entire Indian landmass moving towards English, which you see in various ways. We are talking in English right now. I'm conscious that if I were to speak to you in anything else of India that I know, I would leave a certain number of the audience behind. We have lots of questions whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that we leap so much towards the global language of internet and tech and so on. But you're seeing larger configurations with that happen. And that in a sense, there's a certain logic to it. It isn't somebody being bad-minded. This is the way things tend to happen. It's part of evolution, linguistic evolution.
There's a really interesting quote in your book that kind of jumped out at me. You said something to the effect of English is the perfect tool for apartheid. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, like it's nice to say that English enables people, like all of us in this room, to understand each other. But we are already the top 2% or top 5% statistically of the country. You go into a classroom where you see little children who come from homes where English isn't spoken. Somebody airily says, oh, kids can learn anything, which is ridiculous. Why don't they learn Japanese then? Well, because no one's speaking to them in Japanese. Well, no one's speaking to them in English in a way that could make this particular new life flourish. They're not getting enough English. They are slowly getting access to inadequate, what shall I say, a model that they need to follow. So what happens is in a classroom, let us say in one of the elite schools, you have kids who speak English at home with their parents and don't really know any Indian language very well. And then you have other kids, say in the north, whose parents have sent them to the school in the hopes that they will learn English, but the school has no mechanism for teaching it because that's not the way the elite learned English in India. They didn't learn it from books and from going into classrooms. They learned it from their parents. So you will have a number of people who are completely tongue-tied and will not speak English until they know it adequately. When people say, oh, why don't you just start? No, because English is too bound up with that evolutionary journey you're making. So what you will get is poor children who learn words, nouns here and there, and do not speak at all. They are absorbing slowly, inefficiently. One fine day, they will get up and they will speak. And that's something else I worked on, which is called gestational learning. Any of you who have little children who spoke Tamil or Malayalam or Hindi as little children, and when they started speaking English, it wasn't this week we did the present tense, next week we'll do the future tense. No, they listen to you, don't pay attention to you. At some point they appear to understand what you're saying that you don't want them to understand. I'm going out, who do I leave this child with tonight? Oh no, they're going out. They know. Then comes that day when they just sit, look you straight in the eye and speak in perfect English sentences. This is not written in any pedagogical book on how to teach a language, but it's a gestational thing. It's like when you're born, you don't breathe in utero until you come out and there's air to breathe. And you don't speak English until the operating system is enough that you can not only speak, but more important, understand what somebody says back to you. If you go to France and you know how to say, où sont les toilettes? Where are the toilets? Somebody's going to give you back a huge spiel, which to tell you where to go, you don't understand any of it. You haven't actually learned a language. So there's a huge amount of time that has to be invested to pick up comprehension. And beyond that, it's all the little markers, if you know English, which tell how much you know, where you learned it, at what age you learned it. This is very easy for anyone to make out. When you write to someone in English, it's less easy, you can't hear their accent. But you hear when somebody's speaking, for example, a friend I know who's a professor in IIT Delhi, she speaks good English. It's very much Indian English. But it's absolutely fluent. She has no American accent, though she lived there for maybe 10 years. What does that tell you? Okay, she belongs to that category that always spoke English even before going to the US. To tinge her English with American usage would be to say, I'm one of those who really actually learned her English in the US. That's one step down. So she's one step higher. Then there are those who know how to, but you can imagine what all the categories are. The people who well, there are those who know too much English to want to read books in Indian languages and not enough English to read books in English. So you have a huge category of people who just don't read for pleasure. They read only because they have to pass exams. So you can get a whole ecosystem of people in terms of their relationship to English. And you never have to say, what's your caste? What does your father do? Where did you go to school? It's right there in the way you speak. And you'd ask me, is that's true in many countries, almost anywhere. But the difference is, if you're an American, if you really want to make an effort, you can speak like Walter Cronkite or whoever you want to speak like. The model is there. You understand him. The only thing is that whether you have the initiative to imitate him, you can always do that. But in India, the access to these kinds of models isn't there. What my child can get from me, growing up with me, is very different from what a child I meet for 5 minutes every day or 1 hour every day can get from me. And all of that is going to show in the language, which allows you to use it to see who is entitled, who should be given the best jobs. So English becomes a tool to discriminate. Your English tells everything about what you in this present unequal society are supposed to get. And that's why people will send their children to English medium schools, even if the kid comes home exhausted and not having understood anything all day, because one day they will break through into speaking English and be entitled to jobs that their parents are not entitled to. It's all very complicated. It is to do with language, and yet it's also not to do with language. So when I say English is a good tool for apartheid, it's so efficient, you know?
Fascinating. We were talking about education a little earlier. My sister's a public school teacher in New York City, and because of the wave of immigration now, a lot of her students don't speak any English at all. So they spend their time looking out the window,
Yes.
and they're lost.
Yawning. Yeah.
Yawning and bored. And then you have other students in that classroom that are trying to move forward, and they're trying to bring everybody along, and it's a big challenge. You speak in the book a little bit about working with children, and could you speak about that a little bit? I thought it was fascinating.
It's actually quite it's frustrating that you want to race ahead. Like, one of the things I used to do, because I spent a certain amount of my time being a music teacher, which means composing songs, not only the music, but composing words, and not just in English. But if you're studying Kerala, I saw the last person was talking about Kuttanad, and we learned the song Kuttanad and Punja Yille. And how do we take that chorus forward and create more verse out of it, which tells us about Kerala and not about what the song is actually about. We do it with that. We did it in Punjabi. We did it in Bengali, Marathi. We played around with all these languages, and the kids were happy to do it because we were out of English space. Nobody had an advantage over anyone else. Okay, you get me back to where you were saying that there are certain kids who understand and some who don't. It's frustrating. When you're trying to teach something, let's say I'm talking about bats who fly in the night. Bat. Okay, it's a Hindi zone. They don't know the word bat. So I use a Hindi word, it's a chimgadar. There are kids who don't know that word too, because to sit and look at bats in an evening sky means your parents are home and sitting with you and filling you up with vocabulary and teaching you the kind of thing that literate people need to know in Hindi or in English. They actually are just too overworked to do it. So I would find that I would have to stop, pull out my cell phone, Google a picture of a bat and show them, see what the wings look like and see what they look like when they're flying. And then but meanwhile, other kids want to race ahead, take this knowledge and do something with it, compose a song or write a story. So we have this difference in the class, this kind of phase I have to go through. I have to back up and let the others somehow come on board. Because there is no mechanism yet in India for understanding how to raise children through this. It's not a situation like you learn the present tense, you learn how to make plurals, you learn what are the vowels. That's not what the problem is. The problem is a very different pattern of learning where children know one language and then they slowly wait until they, like a butterfly coming out of a cocoon, they're into another space. How do you race them through that space? How do you make them from being caterpillars into being butterflies? We don't really know. And we also know that if you race a caterpillar into becoming a butterfly, it hasn't used its wings enough to get out. So how do you help children in these classes? I would have my normal suggestion, which I've always given everywhere, and it's in this day and age, Macaulay seems like a radical. I mean, can you imagine a man who said that children should be educated in the home language until class 8? This is the man we've been demonizing because he pushed English into Indian schools for boys. Now, we've gone much further. We're putting 3-year-old children who don't speak much of anything into English and telling them they must learn their basic concepts in English. There's a better way. And the better way is to pull everybody towards the regional language for primary school. What you do after that, that's your politics. Do you want to push everyone into English? By all means. The point is they will go much faster if you get important things out of the way, like what is a bat? What's the difference between a lake and a river? These are the questions that children actually ask. Nobody's telling them. They learn these words. They have to learn their concepts. So my feeling has always been that primary school is not for national integration. It's for very local coming to terms with the world around you, which children need to do. And when you say that your child doesn't know the local language because you speak English. I put my kid in a Hindi medium school, and over class 6 and class 7, they slowly made the transition, first into science and maths in English, and then history and social studies in English, and then they were in English. It was considered the best school in Delhi. But I think that you have to understand the apartheid thing again. Why would many rich parents not like this? Because it's not about making all children do well. It's about giving a comparative advantage to your children. Your children will make it in a hugely biased system. And if the others can't make it, it's actually their problem. English has always been the ultimate, what we call reservation system, the affirmative action for the rich. So that's why, think about it. If somebody studies in the local language until they're about 11 or 12 or 13, they'll still go and be world beaters in Silicon Valley. That's what a lot of those kids are like. Why do you not want it? Because language is about power. And as long as my language controls the job market, I'm going to keep it there. So you say English. So I don't need to tell anyone in the South that that's what the whole Hindi issue was all about. To get Hindi used is to take away any sense of advantage and agency from people in the South. And they rightly sensed it and rejected it. But the point is, English is like that, but except your kids are favored at this time.
Thank you. Peggy, could you give us a glimpse of what you're working on right now?
Right now, I'm trying to take this further back into the past. The tiramisu bear model, I'm working on it, improving it. For example, I don't see any pigeons in India. I see prakrits. So once I have a nice model, it becomes a compass. So the present book I'm writing, mostly looking at things that happened 4,000 years ago. And you divide India into three areas. You have the Northwest, which is the Indus Valley civilization. Nobody's come yet speaking any Sanskrit. They are a later story. Then you have the East, the place where you still have old tribal languages, Munda, Santal, and all the small languages which are linked to them. You have the modern dialects. You have Hindi encroaching. You have the times of Emperor Ashoka, the Buddha, Mahavira, all the Jain Tirthankars, how that whole area took shape even before that. There was a migration from Southeast Asia, which again, tiramisu bear. Men came from Southeast Asian, they left Vietnamese words in a very old first Indian language. So I've done those two. Now I'm looking at the South. And I am just a little mystified at how I haven't heard others asking these questions. My concern is geneticists tell us that the Dravidian component in the South is the same as the Dravidian component in the Indus Valley civilization. So if they are connected and all people came into India as migrants, even the earliest ones, because humans evolved in Africa, when did Dravidians start coming south? And when people say Tamil is the oldest language in the world, it's not. I mean, there are people still in Africa, by the way, and there are people in the Andamans. We're going into 65,000 years, 100,000 years. 4,000 years is nothing. You're very unambitious. But the point is, 4,000 years is the time when the Indus Valley started collapsing as a civilization. So what happened then? How was the South settled? Were there earlier groups of people coming? And as we know, migrants are men. Was there a secondary tiramisu bear experience of young Dravidian men coming south and meeting people who were hunter-gatherers, which is not a bad thing, by the way. We've discovered that a lot of hunter-gatherers can be quite sophisticated. It's just that they don't farm, They may even be doing metal work. So did these people keep coming long before the Indus Valley collapsed? Why do we not hear stories in the Dravidian languages about once upon a time we had brick houses and indoor plumbing and all sorts of things of that kind? You don't hear origin stories. So my question is, and it's a question still, was it men who came again, leaving behind the women? Or was the settlement of the South actually exactly 4,000 years ago and full families? It's very unlikely to have been full families because we know that Dravidians never left the North. There were quite a lot. We in the North, in that part of, are still Dravidian too. So not everybody left. I found out, I have a daughter who's married to a young man who's from Punjab. I asked his parents, well, where are you from? Thinking it's some nice exotic place in the mountains. And they say, Kamalia, both sides of the family. I look up in the map. Harappa. And Harappa is the place in Punjab where you still get sounds like da, erna, and erla. Hello? A North Indian language way up in the Indus Valley where you say sadde naal. Doesn't it sound like Tamil to you? Punjabi is just frighteningly similar to a Dravidian language, and there must be things that were even more so in the past. So I'm trying to look at the connection between the early Dravidians in the north and the ones who eventually came south. When did it happen? And nobody's worked on it, so I have to talk to archaeologists, talk to geneticists, talk to people who look at the Sangam literature. What is there in it that hints at interesting things in the past? So that's, and I'm saying this out because I often like the feeling that when I come to give a lecture or a talk, I come back with ideas. Somebody of you in the audience will know the answer to this and will tell me, what's the story of the South?
Thank you. Do you have any advice for any young aspiring writers out there?
Young aspiring what? Writers. Yes. What's happening?
No, this is just the last question.
Oh, time?
Yes.
Okay. Advice for writers. You have to, if you're brave enough, do it my way. Start writing before you fully know. I've written 4,000 words of chapter 5 and run up against this brick wall. Will the chapter play out as something that's only my imagination, that male settlement of the South? Or will I find something else? I don't know. The point is, start. I don't write like an academic. I don't say I must sit down and start this paper today. I have to wait till the idea has stuck. It's like you can't be pregnant until you're pregnant. All the wishful thinking, it doesn't happen. Some life has to catch and start glowing. And that can be like in the beginning of this book, I was thinking of Frank Lloyd Wright and I was thinking of the song by Simon and Garfunkel. And then I suddenly said, I love this song. The words are unimportant. The tune is unimportant. The architecture of the song is important, and it's about an architect. So I got really excited at the thought, and then that started my chapter 1. So you wait until you have that moment of pregnancy, and then find a way. If you are excited enough, just 10 minutes when your Wi-Fi is working, you can continue writing. And you're writing on a computer anyway, you're going to change it. Just start. I have a destination on WhatsApp where an idea, I can quickly write it and send it to myself, because I know that I'm going to forget half the things that I want to deal with. So I just write them down, send them to myself. And when I'm sitting peacefully at home, and I actually have half an hour and I don't have to go anywhere, I race up to my computer and continue writing. And sometimes I'm in touch with everyone. I'm proud to say my daughter is head of search for Google Search, because Google Search has helped me a lot. I want to find out who did what work in the Nilgiris. Somebody will know on Google Search. Who are the geneticists working on this issue? They come up like that. Who did a PhD thesis on this that will give me data on Malayalam? I need it. It's there. Just keep hunting around. You're sitting, I find I use my phone and I find everything. Sit with my computer and keep writing, because it's like a wave. You can't surf if the wave is not there. But if the wave is there, you better be on your board and ready to move, because that's your chance. You know, you can keep something going once you started it, but catch those moments when you're ready to start writing. This may make no sense at all. No academic would do it this way.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for your time, Peggy.
Thank you. When I didn't even drink any water. I've been thirsty all day.
Thank you so much, both of you. Very entertaining, wonderful, thought-provoking, and humorous and wonderful. We have something for you. I don't know. Come, please. Yes, I thought so too. We should have.
Answers for me. Help me.
Can we just give you this first and then come, and then we'll have a few questions. Yes, wonderful.
You're part of it. You know that. I won't take it further without you.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. John.
Okay.
Hello, ma'am. I really enjoyed the presentation. It was really thought-stimulating. So I particularly like the thesis that language hybridization is due to male migration. So I presume that this is, I'm just proposing another, so what if I propose that the language hybridization is not just due to male migration, but due to privileged male migration, so to say. So two examples come to mind. One, the dominant languages in North America, for example, are from the people who came, who are Anglo-Indians, not Afro-Americans, although both of them were migrants. And secondly, in Sanskrit plays, the Shudras and women speak in Prakrit, wherein the privileged sections of male minorities speaking in Sanskrit. So that is like very, very refined Sanskrit. So this comes to mind that language hybridization is somehow due to privileged male migration and not just male migration. Would it be correct to say that?
Okay, if I heard you right, you used the word privileged, and that's important. That's something I missed, and it is very important. Like when I went to Kerala, I noticed that lots of people are migrating there in recent times. They're migrating in ones and twos and making no waves at all. They will have no impact on the language. They will pick up Malayalam because they need to. What we are seeing, yes, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to add this, that we are looking at privileged, powerful groups who come in and who leave a mark. Because small people who intend to blend and behave don't do it. Now, when you think of who are the big groups in India who left a mark, first the Dravidians who came in from the Zagros area. Well, they were not Dravidians. They became Dravidians in collaboration with the early people of the Indus Valley region, because there's no evidence of these people elsewhere outside of South Asia. The Vedic people, the Austroasiatic people who came into the Munda tribal areas, all the people who leave there, the Mughals, the Nambudris in Kerala, all of these are people who had the power to change the narrative and to pull the society together. So in a way, what happened to language was merely a mirror of what was happening in a larger form of politics. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. It is a serious omission that I didn't mention, that not all migration has this kind of effect. Yes.
Thanks. And I once upon a time, I chanced on.
I can't hear you very well.
Well, when I was traveling in Europe 30 years ago, I met a family from that part of the world you originally coming from. And they were making their first trip to India. So I did dig on where they came from and why and how the migrants were forced to come to West Indies. So then they told me a shocking story of, since you mentioned that the menfolk came first, of course. And what I understood from them was the British at that point of time, they were considerate enough, but again, shocking. How they brought these migrants over there to the West Indies was they hijacked families who came down for melas in the northern part of India. What I understood from them was...
These are Indians from the Caribbean that you met?
I found they came from Guyana, Suriname, those kind of places.
Mostly Suriname, I think, yeah.
So
they talk
what
like
they told
that.
me was that, but I found it a bit too shocking, and I found it unbelievable. But then today when I look at driving the menfolk alone was not that considerate enough. Perhaps during the second wave of grabbing all these laborers. The people who taught them, took them, they were considerate enough to hijack families who came down for melas. But that's what they told me, because then when
we tell you a lot of things. I told people I'd never eaten beef because I thought that's what you wanted to hear. I'm from that community. Yeah.
Yeah.
And can I just get into this a bit? It's a very complicated story. They needed migrants. Okay. The initial migrants to the Caribbean and all these areas were obviously men, and inappropriate men, because they were from the hinterland of Calcutta. They were not farmers. They only took men and they worked them to death. Their conditions on the ships were terrible. So we don't know what happened to whichever one survived. Africans are very welcoming, decent people. They may have had children with Africans who the Africans would regard as their children. So it's not until the 1860s when, firstly, women did go. Women were specially sought because to replicate the next generation. However, very few of the women who went in migration were married to the men who went on migration. A large number of the women were widows, young girls seeing the opportunity to run away from a bad marriage, children going with parents, like my great-great-grandmother went with her father and two brothers. A large number of the couples on the ships entitled to use the married quarters actually were married in the depots waiting for the ship. There was very little of family going. And the word we used was Mughlasia. Mughlasia is an old word, Mughal-style migration, means only the men. A large number of men also, they didn't know how far they were going. And so they went without their families, as they do when they migrate within India. It's nice to say that, I'll just say in my dialect, humke phulam karke liyanal. They tricked us into coming. Yes, but what they meant by tricked us into coming is they never told us that how far it was and that we'd never come back to India. But in truth, even with the option to come back, many didn't do it. So I think that it's complicated when we talk to people from India, because now I'm wearing my other hat as a migrant from the diaspora. We want to impress you that we haven't changed much. It's hard to do because unless you're from Suriname, you don't have the language. I do. But I remember my first book was about this, actually, about the women who migrated. Very few couples. So families were not kidnapped. There was no need. In fact, once you kept going further and further inland into India to source migrants, they suddenly hit upon a community in eastern UP, the Bhojpuria community, western Bihar, which did migrate, and again, migrate a lot within India seasonally, mostly men. And then it happened to hit times when lots of things were happening in India. First of all, you had changes in the land tenure system. So people were suddenly thrown off their own land that they'd owned forever. What do? Famines were coming up. Years of famine always saw more migration. How a woman got, apart from the ones like a mother takes her two daughters, obviously 3 women go, no men in the family. But many women were given cash incentives, a special cash incentive, because we knew that there would be no Indian community if women didn't go. And so that was it. So if you met in Europe the kind of Indian from the Caribbean who needs to live in Europe, you know that there's a complexity that they've burnt their bridges in Suriname by not mixing with the local people. And we do, even I, like I just said to you something in my dialect. I would never say that in Trinidad because that's something I've heard old people say. So I'm giving you a mistaken impression of how similar we are. We actually wanted to be in India. The government says this all the time. They love calling us girmitiyas, indentures, agreement walas. They love saying we're so pitiful. It's very hard for them to take a look at us and see world citizens now. And we feel that we need to impress you that we haven't changed much and that we didn't want to go. It's not like that. Because I've studied quite a lot on the migration. There's a lot that we have done to study these people. And I've done in particular work on women and why they went. It's not as simple as it looks.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you. I have a burning question. I was inspired by what you said about children in classrooms learning their local language. I had a thought that maybe this has more to do with the fact that up to that 8th standard, you said, they have a need to be amongst their people to learn, not in a box, in a classroom with chairs and tables. Isn't that also a large factor? That learning occurs when you are among your, like you said with the bat, you learn that because you sit with your parents in the evening. You need to be amongst your people to learn. So it's like we should be doing more project-based learning, getting out there. Because in Auroville we have 4 languages, but the local language would be Tamil.
Yeah.
And we have, I have a son, that's why I'm so interested in what you said.
Okay, see, let's get a few things clear. One thing I dislike very much in the Indian approach to education is the top-downness of it. The belief that a teacher is someone sent in by the government into an area he or she doesn't really belong in and has to be sensitized to be good to the local people, not something that the local people build with their own objectives of, you see, until class 8, it really doesn't much matter what you teach a child. You teach them to read, write, count, and a little bit about vocabulary and things about the world. That's all. There is no big syllabus that's make or break for the child, but control. The government says, we decide what is the syllabus. And in that way, that's more important than whether the child learns. So if the learning is not the main objective of something as big as a government, and I'm sorry to say that, you're going to find that it makes more sense for the government and the people at the top to say, look, if we work in English, our children will do well. I'm not worried about my brightest children. I'm worried about my less bright children. They will have to confront extremely bright local children, and then they won't have the advantage of language to make them do better, get better jobs, get all the jobs in corporate sector, banks, get the best admissions into IITs because the test is in English, you know? So in a way, there's a deeper question as to whether children's learning is the most important thing in the system's mind. I think you're completely right. This is the way education should go. So when it's not been done this way, that's a very good question. Why?
Thank you.